You know, it's not very often that someone is so famous that an entire age is named after them. But in German history and German culture, we often talk about the period in the late 18th century and beginning of the 19th century, the period from, say, the 1770s up to the 1830s. We often call it the Age of Goethe because Goethe was such a gigantic figure in German culture during that period. The Goethe Zeit, the time of Goethe or the Age of Goethe. So we're going to look at the age of Goethe in this lecture. We're particularly going to look at the period that Goethe experienced after his Sturm und Drang period. He goes to Italy and he becomes convinced that classical style is the most important style in world history, and he starts to emulate that. So we'll talk about that. He brings that style back to the town he's working in, Weimar, and there are a lot of other people in that town at that time. And so around the court in the city of Weimar, there grows this movement that we call German classicism or Weimar classicism. So you'll hear all about that. And then I'm going to turn to his most important work, which is a two-part play called Faust, which is just like in English literature, you might look at Shakespeare's Hamlet and say that's the most important work ever written. In German literature, you'd look at Goethe's Faust and you'd say this is the most gigantic and important piece of work ever written. It's an adaptation of a story we've already come across. We read and talked about the Reformation era version of the Faust legend, the chap who sells his soul to the devil. This is Goethe's Enlightenment version that we're going to hear about today, written hundreds of years later. So I'll end the lecture today by talking about how different Goethe's vision of humanity is from the vision of humanity that we found in that earlier work. So I'm going to start by talking a little bit about Goethe's own life.
Goethe was himself born in 1749 in the town of Frankfurt. He died in 1832. When we talk about the Goethe Zeit or the Goethe era, the age of Goethe, we don't mean the entire period of his life. We mean the period from which he becomes famous and influential, which is the 1770s, as we saw in my lecture the other day about Sturm und Drang. Werther gets published in 1774, and that sets him out into the world as a famous and influential writer. And he is so until his death, and even after his death, when people start to publish his unpublished works, publish his letters, publish his conversations with his best friend. I mean, Goethe, the Goethe Zeit really, you could say, goes on up to the mid-1830s and beyond. He was born in Frankfurt in 1749. When I say he was a polymath, people use different phrases for this kind of person, that it's somebody who is involved in a lot of different areas. So obviously he's a famous writer and a famous poet and a famous playwright, but he also was a scientist, and he studied things like color and the effect color has on the eye. He also discovered, he studied human anatomy, and he discovered a bone in the ear, so he named a bone in the ear that hadn't been discovered, maybe in the ear of a particular kind of animal. I can't remember. Anyway, he was a person with a lot of different interests. He collected minerals, for example, and was fascinated by geology. But no matter what he turned his hand to, he was a success, and he was charming, and he was a beloved man. He studied originally in Leipzig, as I say. He was born in Frankfurt. Leipzig is not very close to Frankfurt, but that's where he studied, and he studied law, and continued studying in Strasbourg. And it was in Strasbourg, as I said the other day, that he got to know Herder and came under the influence of Herder and realized that he had had a very narrow education in some ways, an education that had given him certain tastes that as a young man, influenced by Herder, he realized was not as broad as it could have been. So we met the Goethe of the Storm and Stress movement of the 1770s, and we read a bit of his essay on German architecture in 1772, where he falls in love with the Gothic architecture of Strasbourg Cathedral, and he begins to think that perhaps the way we feel, the emotions we feel on looking at a work of art, are as important as any kind of standardized principle as to what makes a work of art good or bad. Then he also wrote the poem Prometheus, which is considered a great Sturm und Drang poem, and Werther, as I said already. Faust is a work that he worked on all of his life, and after he died, in his materials, people found what they often refer to as the Urfaust. Ur means the earliest or the original in German, and so the Urfaust drafts from the early 1770s. There are parts of Faust Part 1 that he clearly wrote when he was under the influence of storm and stress, as opposed to, for example, the classicist style of parts of Faust Part 2. He was invited as a very young man then. He's 1775, right? He's graduated, he has studied law, and he's invited to be a magistrate, really to be a bureaucrat at the court of Duke Karl August in Weimar. Now, Weimar was a small city, small town. It still is, and it was a Residenzstadt, so that it was a town that had its own court, and it was a ducal residence city. And Duke Karl August and his wife were fascinated by the arts, and so they wanted to build a group of people around them who, yes, would be doing the work of the state, but would also be interesting people, philosophers and thinkers and so on and so forth. So one of the people that they get to come is Goethe, and that's where also he met Friedrich Schiller. So Weimar, the city, is also equally associated with the other great giant of German letters, Friedrich Schiller. And then there's always a debate, would Schiller and Goethe, had they never met, had they never worked in the same or very close to one another in Weimar, had they not been in the same circles in Weimar, would they have written to the high standard that they both achieved during their lifetime? And probably the influence of one on the other meant that they wrote better works that kind of really encouraged each other in writing, critiqued each other's writing, and so we have these two giants simultaneously emerging from the same place. Goethe's private life, he was married, he had children, he had many lovers, he was someone who defied convention in that sense, but people put up with it because he was such a genial fellow and such a clever and talented man. This is a very famous image of him, and it's an image painted by a painter called Tischbein, Johann Tischbein, in 1786. And it marks a watershed in Goethe's life. I've already said a lot about how enthusiastic he was about storm and stress, about this kind of over-emotional, anti-rational writings of the 1870s. Well, after he moves to Weimar, he does something that's very typical of men of his class and of his era, and that is he takes what we might think of as a gap year, and he takes a trip to Italy in order to see the masters. This was something that was called the Grand Tour. Many people, especially young aristocrats, young men, but also upper middle class young people, would take a year to go and see all of the different sites of Europe that they would have only read about during their education. So it was kind of a practical year, and he went to Italy, the land where the lemons blossom, as he called it. And he fell in love with Italy, and he suddenly realized that, when he had that epiphany standing in front of the Strasbourg Cathedral, when he thought, I've had an education that was a classical education that taught me about the ancients and the standards of the ancients and how awesome they all were, and now I realized that I was told lies about my own tradition, that it also is magnificent in its own way, in a very kind of personal German way. When he felt those things, he comes to Italy and realizes that he's actually had a very narrow exposure to classical culture. It's when he sees it in person that he realizes, yes, the Gothic isn't everything. It is amazing, but classicism also has many things about it that that we should emulate, that we should copy, that we should try to achieve in our own time. So this is a famous image because it's not just, actually a pretty bad painting if you look at, it looks like he's got 2 right feet, so it's not the most beautifully executed painting ever, but it's really famous and iconic, kind of an iconic painting of Goethe, because we see the Goethe who is in this sort of graceful pose, almost wearing a toga, but also wearing the gear of an artist, so he looks more like an artist, but he's surrounded by the ruins of the ancient world. Remember that when he's in Italy, he's looking at the ruins, yes, of the Roman Empire, but the Romans emulated the Greeks. So we roll those two ideas very often into one when we talk about Greek and Roman civilization, Greek and Roman art certainly, and Greek and Roman literature. They're very different in their own ways, but because the Romans emulated the Greeks so much, we see this kind of image, and we could just as well be somewhere in Greece. So it's a kind of a part, this ancient world that he falls in love with, the ruins of ancient temples and temple columns here on the right, and this bas-relief of a very Greek image. Now, he wasn't alone in having this kind of attraction to the classics and to the classical world. He is, in a way, Goethe is alone in the sense that once he's had this exposure and once he goes home and he writes a book about it and he publishes a book about his Italian journey, and all of his fans begin to read the book and begin to go to Italy and begin to follow in his footsteps and go to the mouth of Vesuvius, because after all, that's where Goethe went, and so on and so forth. Once that starts, he has an influence that others have not had. But he's not, as I say, he's not the first person to have felt this way, even if the influence he has after he's experienced it is unique. But he's following the footsteps of this chap here. And this chap lived in the mid-18th century. His name was Johann Joachim Winckelmann, J.J. Winckelmann. And Winckelmann took this notion of something that's classic, meaning the best, meaning something that's stylish and timeless, and argued that the ideals of the Greek world and of Greek art are timeless, and they're the best that people have ever achieved, and we, in the modern era, we ought to emulate the Greeks. This is part of a raging debate that is a late 18th century debate. Remember, it's the era of Enlightenment, so people are fond of having philosophical debates, but one of the famous debates of the late 18th century is called the quarrel between the ancients and the moderns, the querelle des anciens et des modernes. And it is a philosophical debate that the two groups opposed to each other. One is saying the ancients were the best that has ever, that in terms of art, in terms of literature, the ancients, the Greeks and the Romans, did it better than we ever will. And so we should always try to emulate them. We should try to copy them and move on from them. The moderns make the argument that we are the best that there's ever been because we are the accumulation of everything that's gone before, and we're something new as well. So the debate among the ancients and the moderns was, do we continue to do what the Greeks did and get it better, like be perfect Greeks ourselves in the modern world? Or do we do something else? Do we just go our own way and presume that we fold into ourselves all of these ancient values, but that we are doing something that's bound to be more progressive than that? Well, Winckelmann was the person who wrote a book in 1755 that Goethe read before he went to Italy as part of everybody's classical education. And if anybody studies art history, they know that they'll know this name Winckelmann because he's considered one of the founders of the field of art history. He's such a famous writer in that particular discipline. But he writes this book called The Thoughts on Imitating Greek Works in Painting and in Sculpture. And that's the work in which he makes this enormous argument that we can't do anything better than what they did, and so therefore we should copy them. And his perfect example of a Greek work was the so-called Apollo of Belvedere. This is Apollo, and this is a statue that happens to be in the Belvedere museum now, palace. And he said that this particular statue, which is copy from the ancient world, this statue shows the principles of these are Winckelmann's words, noble simplicity and quiet grandeur that are at the heart of what makes classical works perfect. What he meant by noble simplicity is that these two things are they coexist in one work, that something is at the same time magnificent, noble, but also very simple in its lines, in its balance, in its symmetry, in its lack of decoration, in it's a very straightforward and so sort of simple simple lines and simple angles, and yet it is expressing a very noble idea. And these other two things coming together, being quiet and being grand at the same time. So it's almost oxymoronic, but these are the qualities of perfect balance that you find, a balance between quietness. There's nothing loud or baroque about a statue like this. Remember, he's writing against the Baroque at some level because he's living at the end of the Baroque era. So he's saying the Baroque is just not better than the Classical era. The Classical era was better because it was quiet, and at the same time, it expressed grandeur through quietness as opposed to expressing grandeur through loud, effusive decoration, like in the Baroque era. So here it is, the Apollo of Belvedere, and of course Goethe, when he went to Italy, would have gone to the Belvedere just to look at this statue, just because Winckelmann said it was the perfect example of a statue. And for centuries since, people have gone to see just this statue or buy copies of just this statue for all of the same reasons, that it's considered the epitome of Greek art. Goethe comes back, he writes his Italian journey, and people begin to read it. He also brings back to Weimar this new deep enthusiasm for all things Italian and for all things ancient. And so we see a transition, a very different Goethe returns from Italy than the Goethe who left. And that's the Goethe who becomes involved in this, in the salons, in the philosophical and artistic circles that are so important in Weimar during the era. So Weimar Classicism is a movement. It is a movement in which everybody involved in this movement is living or working in or around the town of Weimar. They are part of and they visit the court of Karl August and his wife Anna Amalia, and they embrace the values of the classical world and try to bring them into the modern world in their writings. This is a high point of German literary history and art history. Weimar Classicism is more associated with poets and with plays than with anything else. Friedrich Schiller is also considered an exponent of Weimar Classicism, and he dies in 1805, so the convenient date that's marks the end of the Weimar Classicist movement is 1805. It's not like people wake up one day and say, we can't be a movement anymore because Schiller died. It's obviously not anything as simple as that. There's lots going on around that time. Later on we'll see how this is the period when the Napoleonic Wars have begun, and so there's a lot of unrest in Europe, and people are moving away from simply embracing classicism, and new kinds of styles are coming in. So it's just a time, it's just a handy set of dates for us. From Goethe's Italian journey to Schiller's death is the Weimar Classicist period. It was also kind of surrounds the figure of the Duchess Anna Amalia, who has gathered all these people into her court, and it's dubbed the Musenhof, or the court of the muses, that she gathers around herself. And here's a hokey postcard from the 19th century, from way after this was happening, that a tourist going to Weimar might have bought 150 years ago and sent home with a note on the back saying, look, I was in Weimar where all the greats used to be. Here we see Anna Amalia in the center, and people like Herder in the background, but also Wieland. Schiller isn't in this image, but he was part of this circle, and Goethe reading aloud to them. So it's a kind of fantasy of what that might have looked like, that court of the muses around Anna Amalia. But these are the practitioners of Weimar Classicism. That's where Weimar is. I pointed out to you on a map just so that you have a sense. It's that same region where we saw hundreds of years earlier Luther was born and Luther lived. It's not far from Leipzig, which is where Goethe went to school, and where he sets many of the scenes of his story, Faust. Weimar's going to come up again in this course on the last week of this course, because in the 20th century, in the 1920s, the very first German democratic state, the first German republic, is dubbed the Weimar Republic because its constitution was written in the town of Weimar. So Weimar has this kind of cultural capital as a name and as a place in Germany. And when you go to Weimar, you're going to Weimar because that's where the National Theatre is, and that's where there are statues of Schiller and Goethe everywhere, and that's where you can go and visit Goethe's house, which is a fantastic museum. They've kept it the way it was when he lived there, and then they've added a very modern museum at the back. So it's all Schiller and Goethe all the time when you go to Weimar. And Nietzsche. Turns out Nietzsche also spent the last years of his life there, but we'll get to that next week. Weimar classicism too is important because it's not just that they're embracing the values of the ancient world, they're also embracing the values of the Enlightenment. So it's very much, it grows out of Enlightenment thinking too. So they are very engaged with and supportive of the ideas of liberty, equality, fraternity, which are that's the three-word motto of the French Revolution. I mean, this group of people does get very uncomfortable when they see the kind of violence that follows the French Revolution with the terror of the 1790s, but they're initially very encouraged by the spirit of the French Revolution. They think of it as very similar to the spirit of the American Revolution. So they would be supporters of the American Revolution. They would see this kind of turn to democracy and turn to a kind of modern liberty, equality, fraternity, freedom, and so on. They would see that as being also, in its own way, an echo of the classical world, a sort of coming back of Greek values into the modern world. They would have supported the Bill of Rights, the idea of tolerance, and so on, because they thought, just like in classical art, harmony is what you're always striving for. Harmony and balance and symmetry in the art and especially in the sculpture. That's what we should also be looking for in society, a kind of harmony in which human beings are in harmony with nature, the individual is in harmony with society, and nature and freedom go hand in hand. These are some of the famous works of Weimar classicism. You don't need to know them off by heart. I'm just throwing some names up there for those of you who are German majors or minors, because at some point you'll read a couple of these. My favorite of all of them is Schiller's Don Carlos, which I think is one of the greatest works of literature. It was turned into an opera in the 19th century. One of the ones that's most commonly staged might be Iphigenia of Taurus, one of Goethe's Greek mythology plays. But the most famous here is obviously Faust. So let's talk about Faust. Faust was written throughout the course of Goethe's life. He never stopped working on it. And he told the first part of his Faust play he wrote and published in 1808, but he never in his lifetime published the second part of the play, which he worked on from 1808 up to his death in 1832. He was always twiddling away at it, and it was published after his death. So as a play, it's too long to stage all in one night unless you make raucous cuts to it. So if you ever see Faust, you'll usually see Faust 1, or you'll see Faust 2, or you'll see something that's abridged, because it's very, very long. It's a reworking of the Faust legend. So it's a reworking of the Faust legend, and we know the Faust legend because we were here last week. You're going to say to me, I thought we talked about Faust last week, and we did talk about Faust last week. We talked about the 1587 version of Faust. That's hundreds of years before Goethe's version. So Goethe's version of Faust is very different it's the same core story, but he does certain things to the plot that make it very, very different from the version of the story that we read and we thought about last week. That was a Reformation era morality tale. Goethe's Faust is not a Reformation era morality tale. It is a much more humorous work, much more light and yet very serious in some ways, very beautiful poetry in it. But it is a retelling of the Faust story from the perspective of the Enlightenment era. So it's no longer a morality tale, and exemplary. It is a tale about Enlightenment values told in this old, over this old story. Okay, come on. So Goethe was very familiar with the original 1587 story. He would have read the chapbook, the old, very, very popular, entertaining book from that era. But he also would have known it because it had become, over the course of the centuries, it had become a very popular puppet story, puppet show. And so it's still today in Germany, you can go and see puppet shows of the story of Faust. And so he is very influenced by the puppet show as much as he is by the version that he read from 1587. He does some really weird, funny things to Faust. So, for example, let's say you're Mr. Average person on the street and you buy a ticket to see the very first performance of Goethe's Faust in whenever, 1808. And you go in and you go, great, that Goethe, he's a great writer. I'm very excited to see what he does with this story that I know so well about the chap who sells his soul to the devil for 24 years and then 24 years later he gets pulled into hell by the devil. Yeah, can't wait to see that story told by this great writer. But if you went in and you sat down, you would actually have to go through a couple of layers before you actually got to the story itself, because Goethe writes a prologue, 2 prologues, at the beginning and a dedication. It's quite funny. So he writes a prologue in the theatre in which the opening scene shows a playwright and a theatre manager and a couple of other people, and they're having a conversation about how they're going to make money in the theatre. What is it that people come to see in the theatre, and how are we going to get the punters in, basically, to watch a play? So it's a really kind of meta theatrical scene at the very beginning of the play. And then he goes to heaven, and we have the prologue in heaven. There is absolutely nothing like a prologue in heaven in any of the Faust versions that went before. Why does he put a prologue in heaven? Because Goethe adds a layer to this story that allows us to see what God is thinking when he sets up the experiment that is Faust. So again, there's something very modern and enlightened about making the Faust story an experiment rather than a moral tale of moral absolutes that are always true, right? It's an experiment. Let's see what happens. So I'm going to shell out here and take a look at a copy of the text that if you go to the readings section of our website, you will find Faust Part 1 excerpts. It's got a little excerpt from the end of the whole play too, so Faust Part 2, there's a bit in here too. I didn't require you to read it because this being a truncated course, because it's Maymester, we wouldn't really have time to give it to you as an assignment. So if this was a normal semester, you would have read these excerpts. And remember, this is a text that has tens of thousands of lines. And so in putting together this little file, I have cut out like 90%, 95% of it, and I've just highlighted some of the most famous bits of Goethe's Faust Part 1 and at the end of Faust Part 2. So the prologue in heaven in the theatre I've cut, but I want to show you the prologue in heaven. The prologue in heaven shows God and the heavenly host, the angels, the archangels, who are praising God. And eventually Mephistopheles arrives. So this is the Mephistopheles who you remember from the Faust book, is the kind of demon that Faust bargains with and writes his pact with, and who helps him get all his powers and find out everything he wants to know. Well, Mephisto comes up to in Goethe's Faust, but he's there before we even meet Faust. He's up in heaven having a chat with God. So you can also see in that there's a kind of humor. There's going to be a kind of a humor to Goethe's version that isn't necessarily in the original. So it opens with the archangels singing out a praise of God. God created the spheres, and they still are thundering around us. And this inconceivable work is ours. So God has given us this work that is inconceivable, and it is as bright today as it was on the very first day. So herrlich wie am ersten Tag. And they all sing this praise of God, and they all end up with this message that everything is so herrlich wie am ersten Tag. Everything is as bright as it was the day God created it. So they're singing praise to God who's there. And then out of the side onto the stage comes Mephistopheles, and he comes to God and he says, "Oh, you asked to see me, O Lord. So you've come to see me, and I guess you want your regular report on how things are going on Earth. Like, how's the battle between good and evil going on Earth, right?" So Mephistopheles talking to God. Remember, Mephistopheles is not of God's realm, right? Mephistopheles is of the realm of the devil, but he's come to talk to God because God wants to talk to him. And he says, "You usually receive me without pain." In other words, you're usually nice to me, and so I always like to come and see you. Everybody reviles me. I'm reviled by this whole crew. All your angels hate me, but I know that you don't hate me, so it's nice to come and see you. You'll get no word, he says. You'll get no word of suns and worlds from me. In other words, I'm not going to say the words that these angels have been saying about how you're amazing because you created these worlds and these suns and it's all so beautiful as it was on the first day. I'm not going to say those things to you. How men torment themselves is all I see. So we're brought up short by Mephistopheles' report here, where he says, it's all very well and good to say that the earth is beautiful, but people are horrible to each other. And that's what I see. He says the little god of earth sticks to the same old way, the little god of earth being man, right? Man made in God's image. The little god of earth sticks to the same old way and is as strange as on that very first day. So he's echoing that, and is as beautiful, as bright as on the very first day. He says man is as strange as he was on that very first day. And you've given him reason, but it's this heavenly gleam of light, but he only uses it to be more of a beast than any beast as yet. In other words, man hasn't quite figured out what to do with reason as far as I can see. They seem to just torment each other. So anyway, saving your grace, I just thought I'd tell you all of that. God says, "Oh really? Do you always come here to complain? Does nothing ever go right on earth?" Right? So God is saying, you know what, Mephistopheles, you're just not seeing it. You're not. All you see is the torment, and people being beastly to each other. But people do good things too, says God. And Mephistopheles says, "No, as always, it couldn't be worse. I'm so involved with man's wretched ways. I've even stopped plaguing them myself these days." So Mephisto says, "God, people are so bad. They don't need the devil anymore, right? They don't need me anymore." And so I just sit back and watch. And God realizes that he's being challenged effectively. And he says, "Well, okay, do you know Faust?" "Faust? Yeah, I think I know him." In truth, he's your servant? I don't think so. He doesn't seem like your servant, but okay. And God says, "Well, he's confused at how to serve me, but I'll soon lead him to a clearer dawning. And in the future, he'll bear fruit, right? He'll bear flowers and fruit in the way that you can't and he can't see it yet, because I'm God and I know these things." And Mephistopheles says, "Yeah, what do you bet? You want to bet?" "I'm sorry, you're just wrong, God. He's not going to develop into anything. He's crazy, that Faust. Yeah, he's not good. But give me your permission, and I will lead him down the road." And God says, "Okay, I'll take your wager." So they're basically betting on the soul of Faust. And God says, he's deep at heart, he's going to be okay. And Mephistopheles says, no, he's not, because he's going to be typical of all these people who are mean to each other and do bad things. And God says, very, very famous words here. I know I haven't highlighted it, but it ends up being the key to the entire story as Goethe tells it. "As long as he's alive on earth, so long as that, I won't forbid it. I won't forbid you to meddle in his life. You can be with him as long as he's alive. For while man strives, he errs." As long as man keeps trying to do something better, he's always going to make mistakes. And God implies here, and those mistakes are forgivable because they've been done with the idea of striving, of making the world a better place. So Goethe here creates a figure of God who believes that man's doing good is also, or striving to know more is also an aspect of doing good or being a good person. So this is this Enlightenment philosophy that I say is kind of coming through Goethe's version that you just can't find in the Reformation era version, because the Reformation era version would not be saying he's going to try and he's going to make mistakes and it'll be okay. Yeah, as long as he strives and tries to find things out, there's a way to forgive him. In the Reformation era, it's no. There are certain things you shouldn't try to find out. There are certain things that should be kept secret, and you'll be punished for trying to explore beyond the realm in which you're supposed to explore. So this God is a much more enlightened God in that sense, a God who wants, Goethe's God here wants people to strive. We'll come to this word strive at the very end of this play. We're in line 315 here of Faust 1, in line 11,000 and something of Faust 2. This sense, this logic of striving will be brought up again when Faust's soul is saved. But I'm getting ahead of myself. Here Mephistopheles says, well, no, that's great. I'll be like a cat with a mouse. And then off he goes. Heaven closes, the archangels go away, and Mephistopheles is alone, and he says, I like the old guy. I like God. He's all right. And he's a gentleman. He chats with the devil. But now I'm going to go and try and tempt Faust down into my dark path. And then finally, the person who's paid their $20 or their 2 shillings or their 3 marks or whatever to come to the theater and see Faust, finally they're going to see Faust, the Faust that they recognize, the Faust of the opening scene, the scene in his study where he's thinking about how much he's studied and how little he knows. That's the Faust that we met, who was the Reformation era Faust as well. Here I am, habe nun ach Philosophie. I have now done philosophy, I've done law, I've done medicine, I've even done theology, and I've really worked hard. And here I am, I'm as much of a fool as I ever was. I'm no wiser than I was before. In other words, he's saying these books, all of learning isn't enough. I haven't learned enough. And so that's why he starts delving into these darker powers, and he starts conjuring up ghosts and so on in this scene. Eventually, fast forwarding a couple of scenes, we see he's gone for a walk and he's come back in, and there's a dog following him, a poodle, and he continues philosophizing, and he starts to translate the New Testament into German in order to distract himself and to have something to do. Meanwhile, everything he says that's thinking about the New Testament makes the dog go crazy, until the dog finally turns into a person. The dog turns into Mephistopheles, Mephisto. There we get one of the most famous lines in the play, that was the dog's core, which sounds a little silly, but it's a saying in German because of this play. Just like Shakespeare's plays sometimes sound like they're filled with cliches, because Shakespeare coined a phrase and then we started using it in everyday English and it becomes a cliche. This too is a German idiom. So that was, as far as Pudels Kern, that was at the core of the poodle. And it just means in German, so that's what that was all about. Oh, that's what was at the heart of that. Anyway, he says that. That's beside the point. Here comes Mephisto and Faust. And Mephisto introduces himself and says, yes, so I am the spirit that denies. So I am the negative force in the world. That's what I represent. So Faust kind of knows, oh, I've finally conjured up the devil, right? This negative force in the world. Evil is my true element, says Mephistopheles. And Faust realizes he can maybe cut some sort of a deal with this guy in order to find out everything he wants to find out. So there we get to this portion that is, in the older versions, it is a pact, right? There's going to be a pact between Faust and Mephistopheles, and Faust is going to say, I'll give you my soul if you give me everything I want to know and do for 24 years. So that's what we're expecting, but that's not what Goethe does. We see Mephisto saying, okay, I'm going to be your slave, I'm going to do everything you want. And Faust says, well, what do I have to do in exchange for that? And Mephisto says, oh, you'll figure it out as we go along. And Faust says, no, 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 no. The devil does nothing lightly. I want to know what you're going to demand of me. And Mephisto says, okay, I'll be your servant here, and I'll not stop or rest at your decree. When we're together on the other side, in other words, when you've died, you'll do the same for me. You'll be my servant in the afterlife. And Faust is like, oh, I'm not sure, that doesn't sound like a great deal to me. What can you give me anyway? You're only a poor devil, you're not the devil, and I'm not really going to get a lot out of you. So they go back and forth, and Faust says, okay, eventually Faust says, if you ever satisfy me, if I ever find myself snared with luxury, in other words, you've given me something that is so perfect that I say to myself, okay, I want the world to stop and I want this moment to go on forever because I'm satisfied. Finally, I'm satisfied. I don't need to strive anymore. I'm here. Faust says, if you ever get me to that point, then you will have won my soul. So this is a completely different thing to a contract or a pact. This isn't a pact. This is another kind of bet. If you ever get to that point, if you ever make me say the words, stay a while, you are so lovely. See, it's in quotes here. Stay a while, you are so lovely. That's, if I ever say those words to a particular moment in time, if I ever ask time to stand still because I'm so satisfied, then you can grasp me. And Mephistopheles says, done. Okay, that bet I'll make, says Faust. So it's a bet. We've had a wager in heaven between Mephistopheles and God, and we have another bet here between Faust and Mephistopheles. So it's a different order of contract. It's an if. And then everything just gallops off the way it normally gallops in the Faust story, that Mephistopheles makes Faust look younger, and Mephistopheles gives Faust the power to see the past and the future and travel in time and make any woman fall in love with him. He makes a young woman called Gretchen fall in love with him, and he destroys Gretchen in Faust Part 1 because she's under the influence of Mephistopheles. Long story, anyway. For the rest of Faust Part 1 and for most of Faust Part 2, we see Faust and Mephistopheles ratcheting it up, right? Here's Faust always wanting more, always striving to know more and experience more, and Mephisto always running to keep up with him, to keep him satisfied, but never actually satisfying him. So let's skip forward then through all of these. I've left in some of the text that reminds us that Faust meets this girl called Gretchen and falls in love with her, and they get together. And I've skipped almost everything else. And now I'm fast forwarding through to the very end of Part 2 of Faust. And this is Act 5. This is 11,000 lines into Faust Part 2. And we have Faust, and he's an old man here. So he has had an entire lifetime of being entertained by the devil, or being kept busy by the devil, or trying to always strive with the help of the devil. Not the devil, I'm not going to say that, because Mephistopheles is more of a devilish kind of a figure than a satanic sort of figure. So a swamp lies here below the hill, and my last and greatest act of will make the foul pool go away. So Faust is looking at this land, and he's thinking about how he can drain it and make it cultivated land and create a paradise here. And he's just thinking out loud. He's thinking, if I could manage to do that, thinks Faust, right? And again, it's very Enlightenment era notion that you're going to take this land and make it productive, right? So it's very, very fits in with the agricultural revolution that's going on at the same time. Very Enlightenment language here. So Faust says, I'm going to create green fields where before there weren't green fields. And if I can just make that work, that paradise on earth work, wouldn't it be awesome? Then maybe, and now, to the moment I'd say, stay a while, you are so lovely. And this is the phrase we recognize from hours earlier, right? When they made that bet, and Mephisto said, okay, Faust said to Mephisto, if ever I say the words, stay a while, you are so lovely, because I'm so satisfied, then you can have my soul. And note that he's saying here something in the conditional. Faust is saying, if I could make this thing work with my plans with this land, then I might say, I would say, not I'm saying it, I would say it, so I'm not saying it, stay a while, you are so lovely, through the eons, and blah, 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 blah. And it just so happens that this is when Faust dies, because he's been an old man and he's said these words that are kind of the signal that he's dying. And Mephistopheles is like, yay, finally, I finally won. He finally said those words. But along come the angels, and they sweep up the soul of Faust. The spirits take him back and lay him on the ground. But then the angel's chorus begins to sing, and they take his soul up into heaven, with Mephistopheles feeling really like, wait, I thought I just won. And it's because the angels say, he's escaped, this noble member of the spirit world, from evil. And then they explain why. Whoever strives in his endeavor, we can rescue from the devil. It's that same notion that God said at the very beginning, whenever man strives, as long as man strives, he errs. He will make mistakes, but in striving, he will find his salvation. So whoever strives in his endeavor, we can rescue from the devil. And so that is the love that God has for mankind, is the kind of takeaway of what the angels are saying here, of this imperfect being that is man. And so he's welcomed with love into heaven, and Mephisto's like foiled again, and he's lost his wager with God. If we think, why did I say, let's get back, sorry, to our thing. Why did I say that this is an Enlightenment idea? Because the Enlightenment is a philosophy that says that we can always know more. We always need to work on knowing more, and there's nothing wrong with that. That is, in fact, a good way to be. And there's something wrong with that in the Reformation era morality tale of the original, but there's nothing wrong with that in Goethe's Faust. In fact, it's the thing that will save you in Goethe's Faust 300 years later. So I'm just going to I'm not going to say anything for these slides because it's just summarizing what I already said when I was talking through the document, and it points out the line numbers where you will find the key lines that I pointed out. I'll say too that Faust is often described as having two tragedies. Faust Part 1, it's got the scholar's tragedy. That is it's the Gelehrtentragödie, the story of the potential downfall. It doesn't end up being a downfall, but the potential downfall and despair of Faust at the beginning of part of Faust 1. And then the Gretchen-Tragödie, which is the story of, and that's a real tragedy, of what happens to this young woman, Margarete, who Mephisto causes, or he kind of magically makes her be in love with Faust. He makes Faust look young and so on. So there's a love story, but it's a tragic love story because she gets pregnant, she murders someone, she does all of these things in a way that's not her fault because she's influenced by others. And so the story of Gretchen is a really tragic story, and people often remember it from Goethe's Faust 1. But she's gone in Faust 2, and Faust 2, Faust is just having crazy adventures and time traveling and things like that. He has an affair with Helen of Troy, that kind of thing. Just one other thing, I haven't put it here as a bullet, but in German there's also the concept of a Gretchen question. So if somebody says, what about the Gretchen question? You're like, what's the Gretchen question? The first thing Gretchen says to Faust in the play, or one of the first things she says to him in the play is, effectively, do you believe in God? Or where do you stand on religion? And it's a sign of her great faith, actually, this question. And so it's in German culture, it's become a code word for what's your stance on faith? Do you believe in God? Do you not believe in God? How religious are you? So if you're ever talking to a German, that comes up. The Gretchen question is not who's Gretchen or where does Gretchen live or anything. It's simple. It's got nothing to do with Gretchen. It's do you believe in God, effectively. So there's a summary of the plot and the final scene that I talked you through. I do want to say one last thing, and this is a summary slide as to why there are differences between the 1587 Reformation era morality tale and the very, very modern, very progressive and very enlightened version that is Faust's 1808 version. I mean, progressive in the sense of embodying many of the values too of the French Revolution, of liberty, equality, fraternity, and so on. And so in the Reformation era original, God makes no appearance, there's no wager, there's no bet. Faust makes a simple pact with the devil, quid pro quo. Faust laments his fate bitterly, and the devil comes and takes him. It's very straightforward. In the Goethe rewrite, it's all God is really kind of pulling all the strings, and mankind will always err as long as he strives is the mantra that ends up being the thing that saves Faust's soul. And then finally, the bottom line is that the early Faust is a morality tale, and the 1808 Faust is a play with Enlightenment values. As long as we strive, as long as we keep looking for knowledge, as long as we keep exploring the world, we will be saved, and that's where we will find our salvation.